consultant for Patan. Thank you for your time this evening, and the Zoom is yours.
Thank you so much for having me this evening, Patton East, and I'm very happy to be talking to you this evening about inclusion, the why, the what, and the how. Now, before we get started, I would like for you to take a look at this cartoon, and you may have seen this before. It may be your first time seeing it, but what I'm curious about is when you look at this cartoon, what do you notice? And it could be anything, just your first impression when you look at this cartoon. Okay, thank you. We have one coming in. Equality, not equity. Okay, thank you. Could the lettering on the window say one size fits all education? And we have some students looking in and wondering, how do I access the learning and belong here? And when we think of about most educational environments, who is it designed for? And most of the time people would say the average learner, whatever that means, because quite frankly, there is no average learner, because we all come to the table with different strengths and areas of improvement. And if we continue to design educational environments this way, we are designing for no one. And when we discuss inclusion today, think of this image and ask yourself, does my child's learning environment allow for access and belonging for every student? So thank you for answering that question and taking a look at that cartoon. And as I said, I am from Patton, and we are the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network here in Pennsylvania. And our mission is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education. And we also support PDE's commitment to least restrictive environment. So our goal for each child is to ensure individualized education program teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. And we take that least restrictive environment very seriously, as our goal is to ensure that each child is ensured their appropriate and best learning opportunities, and that IEP teams really do begin with that general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. Our Inclusive Practices Initiative has been offering grants each school year for the past 2 years with professional development across the state to promote research based instruction like universal design for learning as a way to include every student to presume competence, especially learners with disabilities. Also, a Patton and the Bureau of Special Education and the Department of Ed are committed to family engagement. And we believe that family engagement promotes equitable partnerships among schools, families, and communities. And these partnerships actively advance student achievement through shared commitment, shared decision-making, and shared responsibility. And so as we discuss again shortly, it is imperative that schools engage families in both the conversation and decision-making process when considering the educational placement of students with IEPs. So my goal for you to leave here today and this evening is an understanding of why of inclusion, and I'll explain least restrictive environment, what is inclusion, and discuss inclusion within the school environment and how to include every child. And I'm going to explain briefly universal design for learning, or as we say, UDL. So as we consider the topic of inclusion, we need to set the context. And since we're going to be talking about LRE, least restrictive environment, we have to start here, beginning with a determination. Has the learner been identified as a person with a disability? And if so, has it also been determined that that learner is in need of supports and services? If that answer to the first two boxes is yes, the next priority is determination of how and where that person's educational services should occur in order to best meet their needs. And this decision is unique to every person, and it is a shared decision among IEP teams. All should have a voice in the determination of how and where the educational services will best meet the needs of the learner. So what exactly is LRE, least restrictive environment, right? That's a mouthful to say. That's why we hear in education, we have a lot of acronyms, and LRE is one of them. So let's work to better define the why of inclusion by beginning with the law, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004. And as the slide reads, IDEA of 2004 supports inclusion by requiring that, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled. And that special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only when the nature or severity of the disability of a child is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. I want to draw attention to some key phrases here, beginning with the maximum extent appropriate. So this is a reference to the term I mentioned earlier, which is LRE. IDEA does not require or command that all children with a disability are always fully included. No, rather it says to the maximum extent appropriate. There may be times or situations when the IEP team decides that it would not be appropriate. So how do we know when inclusion may not be appropriate? Look at the bottom of the slide. Inclusion may not be appropriate when the child's needs cannot be satisfactorily met, even with the use of supplementary aids and services within that regular educational environment. What are supplementary aids and services? You might be asking yourself. So those are the supports or educational tools and technology that learners may need to help them achieve the learning goals. Now, much has changed in special education in IDEA of 2004 when that was passed, including advances in technology and instructional approaches using evidence-based practices such as UDL, both of which have expanded the scope of supplementary aids and services. And therefore, we should be seeing more of our disabled learners be included with their non-disabled peers, right? You would think that. Okay, so that was a lot of legal mumbo jumbo talk, right? It was a mouthful. So what does all of this mean? It means that LRE is the right to meaningfully participate in the general education setting, both academically, socially, and emotionally to the fullest extent possible. And inclusion is realized when every learner, regardless of their designation to receive special education services, are provided with targeted services and supports, allowing them to learn in the general education classroom, interact with their peers, and engage in the core curriculum just like everybody else does. In other words, we can sum up the why of inclusion in 2 words: access and belonging. Inclusion in the general education setting is having equitable access to the curriculum, and with that, creating that feeling of belonging. Okay, now that I've explained LRE and the why of inclusion, let's move on to what is inclusion. So I want you to take a look at this slide. And I recently attended a professional development by Shelley Moore. She's another one of the inclusion gurus out there. And she is known for showing these dots to help visualize what inclusion is and to make sure that we're all on the same page of what our understanding of inclusion. So each of these dot examples represents one of the words off to the side there. So we have integration, segregation, exclusion, and inclusion. Now, which one of these, and you can put the letter in the chat box, A, B, C, or D, which one of these for you represents inclusion? Now, I know that I'm talking to the group, some other gurus here on the call, so which one do you think represents inclusion? Okay, thank you, Fallon. We have C. C. So we have C. Is everybody agreeing with C? Okay, let's see the answers. Here we are. So I knew this team right here is that you guys were gonna choose C, and that is correct, right? So some folks, when I've given this presentation, chose the integration model because that has been their experience of what inclusion may look like in their own schools. The learners are in the space, so if we're really wanting students to be included, every student must be made to feel that they belong and that they have access to the learning while also respecting cultural and individual differences, right? It sounds so easy and simple. But as we found, inclusion can mean and have different interpretations depending on the experiences of each person. So the first step to designing an inclusive educational environment is that people need to believe that it can be done. So adopting an inclusive mindset is a necessary prerequisite before we can design experiences that will meet the needs of every learner. You have to really believe that inclusion can happen. And you might be asking yourself, what does an inclusive mindset look like? Well, it's people who embrace and respect the fact that everyone is unique with different abilities, backgrounds, and preferences, and believes that it benefits everyone when every student is included in working together. Learners brought up in inclusive environments will shape the culture of our future generations to come. And each decision we make as educators and as parents and as caregivers and advocates will act as an example of how to build access and belonging with inclusive practices into everyday spaces and make it the norm and not an afterthought. So let's look at inclusion versus inclusive practices. And while they might sound similar, they are not the same. In fact, inclusion without the use of inclusive practices runs the risk of looking more like integration than inclusion. And remember the integration visual model, right? On the outside, it may appear that everyone is together, but this superficial attempt may not fully provide equity of learning opportunities. Now, with the use of inclusive practices, not only is every student together, but they also have the same opportunity to learn, be supported, and be challenged regardless of their individual variability. And this moves us closer to educational equity and therefore the truest intention of inclusion. Let's refer back again to LRE, right? When we are reporting data from an IEP, we are considering inclusion as a place and what percent of the learner's day is spent in general education space. But if the learner is in general education and sat away from peers, not interacting with the same content, then the true meaning of inclusion is not happening. I invite you to think of inclusion deeper than just a space and who is in the space. Think of inclusion when access and belonging is taking place, when the content is designed in such a way that any learner, regardless of who they are, can participate and learn from that experience. Again, we are presuming competence. So that brings us to the how of inclusion, because despite the established legal framework of IDEA and least restrictive environment, the significant research demonstrating the benefits of inclusion and efforts by all of you, families and educators, the barriers to general education still remain today. So how can educators include every learner? Universal Design for Learning is a research-based instructional framework, and it is based on the premise that every student will have an equal opportunity to learn and be successful when educators design environments that honor variability and diversity. The barriers to learning exist not within the learner, but in the design of the learning environment. So before we get into UDL, and I'll be referring to Universal Design for Learning as UDL, I want you to think of a time when you learned something and you really enjoyed learning it. And as you're thinking about that time that you enjoyed learning something, why did you enjoy learning it and what kept you engaged? What got you excited about learning this? Whatever it is, it could be a musical instrument, it could be knitting. Did you learn something and you're like, oh my gosh, that was the most fun and exciting thing I've ever learned? I'll give a moment, see what's in the chat here. Okay, Deb, something was fun and it made you laugh. What was it?
Yeah, years ago we had taken country line dance lessons.
Oh my gosh.
So it was fun. You had you were with other people, some of which we just met, and we'd laugh at each other, we'd help each other out. We did the same thing. My husband and I had taken ballroom dance lessons, and it was a scream. And what was amazing to us is, at the time, now we're talking maybe 25 years ago. So we're like youngsters, and these white taken what they were saying, but then everything was, you work together as a team, and that was so critical.
Yeah, it was very critical. And some of you, out there, you might want to learn whitewater rafting. Maybe that sounds a little scary. Maybe the country line dancing sounds a little better. So, the reason why these different activities and learning goals, we have different reaction to it. It's because that we're all motivated and engaged by different things. Something I find exciting you may not find exciting, or maybe whitewater rafting sounds a little too scary. And this is what makes us different. It's how we vary in different ways of engagement, what sparks our interest. And UDL calls this learner variability. That's when I say learner variability, that's what I mean. We all have different interests and different ways that we perceive and take in information. And so, even if you don't like the idea of learning to whitewater raft, there are many ways for someone to meet that goal of learning whitewater rafting, like watching a video or reading written directions first, or maybe somebody needs a trial run on land or something. So some of you, stated ways that you like to learn, and you're thinking about how you like to learn that helps you stay engaged and motivated. And so now that I told you about some different ways that you could learn whitewater rafting, maybe it sounds more appealing to you to meet that goal. So could you learn whitewater rafting if these were some of the choices that were available for you to meet the goal? What else would you need, What else would you need to learn and be successful? So that's UDL, kind of the mindset of UDL, is that there's many different ways for everyone to meet that same goal. And now think of your child and think of students, think of your child, what excites them? How do they have choices to learn and show what they know? Universal design for learning allows for opportunities to be built in from the onset with flexible options in order for students to express what they know. So we have multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. So even if you're not familiar with the term universal design, you've likely encountered many examples of it in your everyday life, like closed captions, automatic doors, when you go into a Target, or some accessibility features on your smartphones. Now that I'm, getting past 45 here, I need to zoom in with the text on my smartphone, that's for sure. And I'm very grateful that I have it there. But people who don't have disabilities may also benefit from using them. Like I just gave you that I don't have a disability. I mean, you could say I have a visual impairment, I wear glasses, but on a norm, I don't have a vision disability. However, I'm benefiting from that accessibility feature in my smartphone. Also, closed captioning on TVs. That's built in for people who have hearing impairments to see on-screen text of what's being said. But closed captioning benefits everybody. Now, here's another example. I tried to watch a movie, June. So if you've seen that movie, June, or if you've seen the movie Spencer, there was a lot of whisper talking happening. Or if there's a movie when somebody has an accent and sometimes I don't quite hear what they're saying or understand, I turn up the volume, I still don't understand. So you know what, I needed to put the closed captions on to follow along. And here's the other thing about that. It was my choice. I decided that I needed that support of the closed captions. And I sometimes don't need the closed captions. So for the most part, I don't need them, but it's there for anyone to use. So UDL provides that same kind of flexibility in the classroom. By applying UDL principles, educators can effectively instruct a diverse group of learners. They do this by building in that flexibility and support in ways that learners can access information and in the ways learners can demonstrate their knowledge. So here are some questions that might be floating around in your head as you're thinking about UDL. So one of the questions, why is UDL helpful? Why is it helpful for my child? And when an educator enters an environment with a UDL mindset, they see that learner variability as the norm rather than an exception, and they intentionally plan for that. So planning for learner variability means offering that flexibility and choice in the ways that students can work towards the same learning goal and helps keep expectations high. Another question you might have is, how is UDL different to differentiation? We get this question a lot. So if a task is universally designed, then consideration is given to the potential barriers in the curriculum, in the instruction, and the materials from the onset, not an afterthought, in how they can be removed to ensure the learner can succeed. The educator can consider different options to motivate learners, which is engagement, different ways to support understanding, which is representation, and different ways for learners to show what they know and understand. So that's the action and expression. So the way this differs from differentiation is that instead of the educator giving an individual child an additional or an accommodated task, the learner can select from the options made available to the whole class. The learner is able to choose, so it's putting their education in their own hands. So they're able to choose when they need support. And then also by doing that, singling out that child is in that stigma is removed. So how is UDL different? Sorry, let me see. Oh, how is UDL relevant to my child? So UDL is relevant to every child, since the goal of UDL is to develop expert learners. Expert learners are described by UDL as being purposeful, motivated, resourceful, knowledgeable, strategic, and goal-directed. With UDL, students learn to take responsibility for their own learning. This could be the way they select technology to support their writing, the way they use feedback to self-reflect and improve their work, or the way they seek support to manage frustration or stress. So these are all useful strategies to transfer over into everyday life, because as we become adults, we have to know how to make choices and decisions. If we don't teach our children and our students how to make choices for themselves, I mean, we're doing a disservice, in my opinion. So how can UDL support parents and caregivers to engage with their schools? And this is another question we get a lot. So if a learner is experiencing difficulties at school socially, emotionally, or academically, UDL is an approach that can help guide conversations with schools. Focus on what your child can do, what the current barriers are that are in the learning environment, and work together to come up with solutions. So I'll give you an example. So if you hear this from somebody, we're not going to like mention names or anything, but somebody maybe in a school might say, your child's handwriting is very slow and difficult to read. So my question then as the parent would be, well, what is the purpose of the task they have been given? What are the alternatives to handwriting? And when can they be used? So you're coming back with, a question about with UDL in mind. And then hopefully what will happen is that the educator makes the learning goal and expectation very clear to the class and gives every learner the choice on how they demonstrate what they have learned. So it could be handwriting, it could be with the word processing, using Word, it could be mind maps or illustrations, right? So what we're doing, even a scribe if needed. So when somebody gives you this, your child's handwriting is very slow and difficult to read, and that's the reason they can't be included. No, you can't accept that answer, because as I said, we are in the year 2022, and the technology and the things and educational tools that are out there can be a support for anyone. Okay. So now I have said a lot in a very short period of time, and I do want to provide you with some resources to take to deeper your own education and review all of the benefits of inclusion and the use of inclusive practices. Let's see, this shot right here on the slide comes from a patent publication titled The Teacher's Desk Reference for Inclusive Practices. And I will put the links to that in the chat. I encourage you to review this publication, especially this chart, for the many benefits that inclusion offers to students, as well as the benefits to teachers and to families. So I will put all that in the chat here in just a moment. So let me leave you with these thoughts. So Ronald Mace was an architect and coined the term universal design. It means designing all products, buildings, and exterior spaces to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or special design. He based universal design on these three principles. Disability is not a special condition of few. It is ordinary and affects most of us for some part of our lives. And if a design works well for people with disabilities, guess what? It works better for everyone. And one other thing, Michael Nesbeth, and I put the link to his TED Talk. And what he said is, when you achieve universal design, it snowballs. Every student is welcome and included, even when you do not share the same disability or have a disability, everyone benefits. We all experience disability, whether it's, cognitive, physical, emotional, or temporary. Disability drives innovation, right? This is important. Disability drives innovation. The existence of disability makes you produce and create new solutions. It does not impair you. So I thank you for your time this evening.